Day 4 of the 30-day UI UX design series. This is exciting because this is the first time you're going to actually be put to the test. I'm going to show you exactly how to build a navbar on a desktop design. This one right here. Then at the end, utilizing what you learned, I want you to take this design and do your own navigation based on what you learned. Then I want you to submit it to me, and tomorrow I'm going to check out some of these and I'm going to make improvements, and I'm also going to give shout outs to ones that didn't need improvements. This way we could all get better together. Now I know what some of you are thinking, 30-minute video on a navbar. Well, that's because I really want to cover a lot of the foundational UI UX design principles, which I do in this video. And so it's a little bit lengthy, and I know a lot of you are used to watching 60-second design tutorials on TikTok and YouTube Shorts. That's all the rage these days, but guess what? You're not going to get better by just spending 60 seconds. Take the time to watch this video and then have fun with it at the end when I give you this Figma document that you'll be able to replicate, and then you'll be able to do your own little navbar design and then submit it to me, and the instructions are at the end. So I'll stop talking. It's already a long video. Let's get started.
All right, everybody, you excited? We're ready to finally get started after 4 days. And the first thing I want you to do is click on the Figma Community File, and it's going to be linked wherever you're watching this in the description or so. And this is a template that we're going to be using for all the projects that are part of this 30-day UI UX challenge. And you want to click Open in Figma right here. Now, when you do that, it's going to open up this page right here. So this is what Figma looks like. This is the desktop version. You can download it, or you could use the web-based version. They're very, very similar. And essentially, this is the project that we're going to be focusing on. As you can see, there's what looks to be like on desktop. This is like a desktop frame, a hero section, the top part of a section, but it's lacking a navigation. And so that's going to be your challenge in this page right here. You can see it's an entirely different layout, and that's going to be your challenge for the end of this. But we'll get to that in a bit. So first, I wanted to talk about what actually navbars are and what their purpose is. And this is very simple. You should understand this. If you've used the internet at all on a desktop, like on a laptop or something, you have the browser maximized and you see a navigation. And there's a typical pattern for that. You typically have the branding logo on your left side, and then on the right column, you have the navigation, like the home, about, frequently asked questions, contact us, join now, something like that. And so when we create a navigation, we have to ask ourselves, what are the pages? And we also need to make sure that based on what's currently designed here, that it fits, it will fit well, okay? And what we need to do, if you could look up here, we always have to ask ourselves whether we're designing for a navbar, a UI card, a footer, anything, any type of UI element, we always have to ask ourselves, especially when you're first starting out, is the visual hierarchy good? Is the contrast good? Is the color, the alignment, the white space, the groupings? So you can see right here, I have included a little check mark and an X right here, right? So what we're going to do once we finish designing this desktop navigation is we're going to ask ourselves, is the visual hierarchy good? And don't worry, if you don't know what that means right now, I'll explain when we get to that. Is the contrast good? And if so, we're just going to drag things over here and we're going to duplicate them, and we're going to make sure we cross all the T's and the dots and the I's, okay? So I'm going to back up here. And let's get started. So right here, you can kind of see over here, we have a logo called Laracode, and then we have pages. These are not really styled except for the logo. And typically, if you're working for a client or whatever, they'll provide you with the logo asset. And the first thing, like I said, that we want to do is we want to place this over here. So what I'm going to do is just duplicate this. And the way you can do that, you can duplicate multiple ways. Here in Figma, you can hold Alt, left click, and just drag. Or you hit Control D, and that will duplicate as well. Okay, so we're going to place this over here. And where should the logo be placed? This is a good question if you're kind of unsure. Well, what I want you to follow, and right now we're going to talk about alignment, which is one of the UI foundational principles right here. We're going to talk about alignment. if you notice right here, it looks like the headline and all this type right here where it says console, and then also this first little trust symbol, Tesla right there, it's all aligned on the same vertical axis. So if I hit Shift R and I left click and drag on top of this, we'll get a guide. And you can see how everything is lined nicely right to that. So it would make sense to also align our logo along that same column. This is alignment, all right? It's very important to understand this stuff. So if I hit Shift R again, we can hide that, and we can always bring it back by toggling it, Shift R, like that. And you could also drag down horizontal guides as well. Control Z, of course, will undo stuff like that. So Shift R, let's hide that. So now we have this aligned where it makes sense logically based on what's already designed, okay? So that you cannot go wrong there. So alignment is checked off, at least in relation to the logo. Now, what about white space? You can see white space right here. So what is white space? White space is simply the empty areas of the design. And that sounds kind of boring and like a nothing burger, but white space is extremely important because if things are too close together or they're too far apart, they do not feel right and it will break the beauty of the layout. So the next question we have is, where do we put this in a vertical context? Like, do we put it here? Do we put it up here? Like the very top? Well, typically there's not going to be any right answer, but I would say it makes sense to put it right around here. And of course, you have a degree of flexibility and subjectivity. Like for instance, I would not put it any closer than about here to the top or any further down than about maybe right around here. Now, how would I know that? Well, we need to take a look at the entire design as a whole. And we have to get a feeling for how things in white space is being applied based on what's happening. And so it would not absolutely make sense if we put this like right here against the edge because it just feels like it's too close. And this is one of those things that you just have to develop an eye for eventually. So I'm going to put it like right around here. And that seems like a nice, good area for it to have enough room to breathe. Okay, when things are cluttered, it's harder to see them. Okay. So next up, we have our actual pages. And you can see the way it's displayed here, it's a vertical navigation, but it's not meant to be a navigation. It's just to let you know what pages we need. So in the context of a primary navigation on desktop, like 99 out of 100 times, you want it to be a horizontal navigation, meaning that instead of things being stacked on top of each other like this, they're going to be stacked from left to right. So let's go ahead and design for the actual pages. So I'm going to hit T for the type tool, and I'm just going to type in home. Now, the first question we might have is, what font will we use? Well, in this case, we already have the design here for us. Right now, we're designing with training wheels on. And what that means is I've already provided the design for you. So a lot of the thought the thought processes are cut down because a lot of this stuff's already defined. So if you're working on an existing design and we're adding, in this context, some type here, we have to ask ourselves and we have to look where are the other, what other fonts are being used here. And I can see two. We have Enter right here. This is Enter as well. And then this stuff right here, we could see is Consolas, all right? So it's kind of like a codey sort of font. And you could use either or for this case. So when it comes to design, there's a lot, in art in general, there's a great degree of subjectivity. And then there's also things that are objectively wrong and false. So what we could do is we could experiment with both of those. So we can change Enter, say, for instance, to Consolas. Okay, maybe make it bold. All right, so that seems like it works. Now, what about over here? Actual, do we think it needs to be bold? How about all of them? Should all the links be bold, or maybe just the currently active page? Could that be bold? These are all questions that you can ask yourself as well. What about font size? All right, so now we're going to talk about another aspect. And this is called, be quiet, that's my phone. This is called visual hierarchy. And visual hierarchy is an extremely important concept to understand. And essentially, it means where do we want the eye to be directed to? All right. Visual hierarchy doesn't just relate to UI UX design. It's an art design in general. It's a principle. And if anything is too large, for instance, then that's what's going to take people's attention because it's really big and bold. That's why your headline, if that's the first thing you want somebody to read, which it typically is, you want that to be large, okay? So what about the font size? All right, so the font size in relation to what? Well, the closest element here is the actual logo. So would it make sense to have like a home button this size? I don't think that's bad, actually. That font size here is 24. I think that's a fine font size. Now, if we bump this up to 50, you know how ridiculous this looks? It doesn't look right. It's too large. And likewise, if we were to go down to, say, 12, that's going to be really hard for people to see, okay? So your typography font size is one of the biggest ways that you reinforce visual hierarchy. And basically, visual hierarchy is about establishing elements of importance based on priority. And you style it and you establish that visual hierarchy by adjusting all these other fundamentals. I just realized I also need to put in typography right there as well. Okay, so 24 would actually be a good size. So I'm going to put 24. And for now, I'm not going to worry about placement too much. I'm just going to go ahead and put in home, curriculum, fact, contact, and join today. So there's a couple ways of approaching this. I'm going to do it the real simple way, but it's also the less dynamic way. And the reason I'm doing that is because I don't want to drown you with too much information up front. So we're not going to be focusing on the correct way to do this stuff yet, which would be through components and component variants here in Figma. We're not going to mess with that. So don't worry about that for now. We will later in this course. So just to make things easy, we're just going to duplicate this. So Control D or Command D or Alt, left click and drag to the right. We're going to put in curriculum. Okay. So another question that you might have for yourself is, okay, so we have curriculum. How far apart should these be? Well, remember, what is the fundamental that refers to the space between, the empty space between elements? That's white space, right? So just with font size, where I demonstrated too large and too small, there's also too much white space and too little white space. So before we experiment with that white space, let's get the other links here just so we can experiment. Now, I will introduce auto layout to you, and it's a core fundamental of Figma. If I take both of these elements, double click, hold shift, left click, and double click. So now we have in our layers, both of those elements selected right down here. We can add what's called the auto layout right here. So we click plus, and it puts it into this auto layout. In our property inspectors right here, we can see if we adjust this value, we can increase or decrease the amount of white space between these two links. Now, what's also really cool is if we just double click and we select curriculum and we Control D and duplicate it, it's going to maintain that white space in between. And if we hover over, we can also real quickly adjust it. Okay, so what are the other links? We have FAQ for frequently asked questions. It's going to lowercase that. We'll duplicate that one, Control D. We also have contact. All right, and then we also have join today. All right, so join today. Okay, so we have to ask ourselves, what is a suitable amount of white space, right? So for us, I would say too little, let me just show you the maximum and the minimum of the subjective degree to which it's okay, and an okay amount of white space. I would not go any smaller than perhaps, I go a little bit larger than that. I think that's too close. So I would take this and let's adjust this. I wouldn't go any closer than this, which is a value of 40 pixels between each link. Now, I also wouldn't go wider than perhaps right around here. any wider and they will start to feel a little bit too separated in distance. So this is also referred to as grouping, okay? Right here. Is the elements that you're grouping together, does it make sense how you're applying white space to them and alignment? So that's real important as well. So here we have join today, and we have to ask ourselves also, is there anywhere where it makes sense to where we should style these links differently based on the context? So in primary navigations, you should always have what's called an active state button. You know, which page are we currently on? Well, this is the home page. So we can denote that this is the home page in a number of different ways. You can make it bold, and that can give you a visual separation between the other elements. You can also change the color. So for instance, now we're talking about color. If we were to change this to a certain color, which color would make sense? Well, we can see our primary color here is green. It's the only other element, only actual color outside of whites and grays, blacks, that we have. So it would make sense to use this same color and then perhaps make it a little bit darker because we have to ensure contrast is correct. So if I grab this, okay, this looks good, right? But this is hard to see. It's really hard to see. So I want you to go ahead and come up here and click on plugins and type in Stark. All right, Stark Contrast and Accessibility. I want you to install this plugin. So if you're brand new to Figma, it has plugins that extend the functionality of Figma itself. And Stark is a contrast and accessibility checker. All right, and we're going to be using this a lot. So when you install that, if I select this type right here, and I click on right-click and over here somewhere, and I go to Plugins, and I click on Stark, and then we click on Contrast, with this home button selected, you'll see it says all this weird stuff, which is confusing, and I'll describe what this is now. So right now, you want green check marks on some of these elements. This is telling us that there is not enough contrast. All four are just X'd out in red. That means it's hard to see, okay? And it gets these values from the WCAG, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guideline Standards. And basically, they've done a lot of research and defined, okay, at what acceptable level is there enough contrast for people to be able to see, especially people who might have vision impairments. So the one way that we can adjust this while keeping the same hue, the same green color, is we can tint it. We can add darkness to it. So the way we can do this is, if I just move this over here, we take this color picker, and all we have to do is just drag down this value right here. So when we do that and I scroll out, you could see that now it's changed to 3.35 to 1 ratio. And let's move this over here. All right, now we're at 3.75. Now we're at 4.5. This is what we want. All right, so AAA would be just really high contrast, but this is still acceptable if it's at least a 4.5 to 1 ratio. Large text, you can get away with less contrast, a 3 to 1 ratio, as long as it's large. This is not large text. So right there is a good color value if we wanted to have color. And this right here lets the user know that this is the currently active page. Now you could also do this by adding an underline or a little icon or a little circle next to it. There's a lot of different ways to designate the active state. Okay, now that we have that, does it make sense anywhere else, in your opinion, to emphasize or style any of these links differently? Well, I would say yes, and that is the join today, because this is a really important element. There should be a goal for every web page or every app or every page of an app. There should be a goal of some sort. In this goal, we want people to join our service, right? So we want this to be styled different. We want it to stand out, okay? So it needs to be grouped or styled differently from the rest of this stuff right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take join today and just yank it out of there. And then we're going to take this, and then up here in the property inspector, you'll see these little weird icons. These are for alignment. If you click this one right here, the second one, align horizontal, this will align it horizontally perfectly within, based on the width of the frame here in which it resides. So now we could take this and just put it over here. Okay. So that looks pretty cool. And now we've changed the groupings in a way that makes a little bit more sense. So we could do this, we can really emphasize this as an actual button in many different ways. We could put it in a button container like this. We could make it bold, perhaps, and we can make it our primary green color over here. Yep, that would work. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Like I said, we could also take this and we can put it behind it. Now use your left bracket key and that will automatically shift the currently selected layer to the very bottom of the frame in which it resides. So now we have this big old button and we want to get this aligned up correctly. So what we will do is we're going to select both of these and click Auto Layout. So remember, to select both the elements, we have our type here. I'm going to hold Shift, left click, and that selects both of them. Then we click on Auto Layout. And we want to make sure it is centered right here. So now what's cool is we can do other stuff in terms of adding white space around elements and moving this stuff around. So I don't think I like having it a white background. I think this button background, if we come down here and we select frame 6, or we can just double click and rename this to button BG, we can take the fill, which is the background color, and we can make that our primary color down here. Now we can double click and select the type, and we can make that black. Okay, now we have to ask ourselves, does this look centered, this text? Well, sometimes when you're dealing with text, you can have some overflow issues with the bounding box. And so I'm just going to slightly decrease the height so that it gets centered vertically in there much better. Okay. So here's one thing I might do is reduce the stroke width because it's a smaller button and this is a thicker stroke. So I'm going to reduce the stroke width by double clicking on our button BG frame. And we're going to go ahead and reduce the actual stroke from 5 to 3. There we go. All right. So now that we have that, another thing that we really have to ask ourselves is, do we have equal amount of white space from the left of this logo based on the white space that's visible to the right side of the final element on the same horizontal path? So in this case, it's the Join Now button. Is there equal white space? So the way you can determine is to take the actual frame, you select it, and in the property inspector, right where it says Layout Grid, we're going to click this little eye icon to toggle that visibility. And essentially this will allow you to make sure that you have equal white space on the right and left. So we could clearly see this is not set up correctly. So what we do is just take it and we make sure that it's aligned where it needs to be. We also need to make sure that it's aligned in a way that makes sense based on the other elements here. So I've aligned it to the center of this text. So Join Today is now exactly on the same horizontal path of the rest of these. And this also, you can see it's perfectly in the center here of this Laracode logo. And that right there is actually a pretty solid, let me hide that, a pretty solid Navbar. And it's not crazy complex, but it kind of feels that way. So let's go through these and make sure that everything checks off. This visual hierarchy makes sense. So in order to answer that question, the visual hierarchy of this top section right here has to be compared to the other elements that are adjacent to it. So what is it? So we have a headline and then we have a subheadline right here. All right, well, we know that the headline needs to be the element that people see first because it educates them as to kind of what this page is about, right? Or what this website is about. So we want that to be the biggest element. We don't want anything in here being bigger, right? We don't want like the layer code type to be like 80 pixels because then it competes too much. So that's what visual hierarchy is. So everything here looks to be in line and make logical sense in terms of its height and its size and all that. So the visual hierarchy passes. Now what about contrast? So remember, the only contrast issue that we had was on this home because we added color to it. But we used stark contrast checker to the plugin to ensure that it's actually contrasting enough. Now, of course, because we have a white background with black text, that is maximum contrast. So we're not going to have any issues there. You may want to see what your contrast looks like with black on this green color, but this is sufficient as well. So we're going to go ahead and denote that as a good one. Now, what about color? Well, the colors are fairly simple. We're using black and then just the same exact hue with a different shade over here and over here as the rest of the page. Now, you could add another color, but the safest option is to have fewer colors, especially when you're starting out. So our color's good. How about alignment? All right, so we're aligned along the same column right here, as you can see. Now, what about this? We drag this down. We put this into center. Everything is aligned to the center of this element, which I like, and it works well. So there's also equal white space between here and here. So that's good as well. So for alignment. Now, what about white space? Again, if we were to take this, all three of these elements, if it was up here, we would not have good white space because it's just kind of tucked up there a little bit too close, especially given the fact that we're on a desktop frame here, essentially. When you get to smaller sizes, you also reduce your white space. When I mean smaller sizes, like for instance, going from desktop perhaps to like tablet to phone, typically you reduce your white space with the less physical width that you have. Okay. So let's take that. I'm going to back up there and a few times. Just there it is. That is good white space. So what about grouping? All right. So are we grouping things that make sense together? And one of the primary ways you establish grouping is through white space and alignment. So we have our logo here. We have our 4 most important pages right here. And then we have the primary call to action, a link to it in the head or the header, essentially, the navbar. And this works perfectly fine. Everything makes sense. And then finally, typography. Make sure that you're using consistent typography. Make sure that your font sizes, which is a part of typography as well, are making sense. And so I would say this passes. Now, I'm not doing anything crazy with crazy effects. It's very simple, and typically that is what you want. So now we're going to get to the fun part where you are challenged. So now click on Lesson 1 Navbar Challenge. You're going to see the same sort of situation here, except this time I'm going to leave a few things up to you. I'm going to leave what color you're going to use. So all you have to do is just take this, just Alt, left click, drag, put this somewhere that makes sense. And then what color are you going to use? What makes sense to you? I'm not going to give you any hints, but anything that you do use, make sure that you're checking with the stark contrast checker to make sure that you adhere to at least 4.5 to 1 ratio. So I want you to build out a navigation. And notice I threw in a little bit of a curveball. We want to include this icon as well. And if you want to change the colors of this, you just click on the element itself, which we have currently selected, and you click on Selection Colors, and then change the color here. So I want you to include a search. So think about how you're going to be grouping things together. Very important. So when you're finished and you've checked all of these off and you're confident that you did a good job and you want me to check it out and you don't care if other people see it as well, click Share and then click on Copy Link. That copies it to the clipboard. And then get out your browser, and then I want you to go to x.com or Twitter, and I want you to, and if you don't have an account, then create one. Then I want you to also follow me. I'll link this in the description here. Follow me here on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it. And then I want you to make a post. Just paste in that Figma document, and then also mention at 30 or the hashtag 30 days UI UX, just like this. And then you can also tag me if you want at DesignCourse.com. You'll see me right there. And you can also leave a comment or whatever. What does everybody think about my challenge? And what I will do is I'm going to take a look at these. And if we get enough good submissions or bad submissions or enough submissions in general, tomorrow we're going to take a look at these and I'll review them live. I can't do every single one of them, but I'll pick out a few good ones and a few different ones that need to have fixes. That way we can grow and learn together. So I know this was a long video. That's because I had to really talk about those fundamentals. Going forward, I'll try to make these quicker. But hopefully you hung with me, and if you did, definitely submit your work and make sure you get it done here within the next maybe the max 8 hours, because I need time to actually look at these and create the video. So I will see you all very soon. Goodbye.